Hi, my name is Will. This is a presentation on the presentation of films and movies over time. Now, to start off with an introduction, the origins of film aren't too clear. Motion pictures do have some roots in early photography. That was essentially the beginning of it. And over time, the presentation methods of film and motion pictures have advanced quite a lot. To start with the origins, what could be called the underpinning would be the zoetrope. So essentially, here as we see, we have a rotating cylinder. Now on the inside there would be a series of images, usually about 12. On the outside of the cylinder we have slits. Now when you spun this cylinder, if you look through the slits, the succession of images would create an illusion of motion. That would be the beginnings of it. Now next up we have two devices which would be considered companions to one another. First off we have the kinetograph. This was commissioned by Thomas Edison and it was designed and invented by his lab assistant W.K.L. Dixon. Essentially, he retrofitted a mechanism from a clock to spool film through the camera at about 40 frames per second. That's how fast it would be imprinted. And then second off, we have the kinetoscope here. This is the viewing device for film shot by the kinetograph. Pretty much, there is a shutter here which is illuminated by an incandescent bulb. You would look through it and there's a mechanism that will continuously spool film through here. And then lastly, we have the cinematograph. This was invented by the Lumiere brothers. They were inspired by the kinetograph and the kinetoscope at an exhibition they saw in Paris. This was a lot more portable. It was a lot lighter, and you hand cranked it. This would imprint film at about 16 frames per second. As technology improved and advanced, films became more commonplace. Then we moved into the silent era of the 1910s, the 1920s. Because there was no synchronous audio, films would be accompanied by live music in theaters to match the mood of the film itself. Now there were two types of silent films, well, major silent films. There was the single reels to start off with. It was one film reel. It was cheaper to produce. It was shorter in length. And then you had multiple reels, which were also known as features. These were longer, they had more elaborate production, they had higher quality, but at the same time they were much harder to produce and distribute. They were more expensive. They also added a bit more class, I guess, to viewing films in general. Then as we move into the 20th century, we have the introduction of sound. Now there were two very significant ways of sound on film and sound on disc that I mentioned here. We have phonofilm, which was patented by Lee DeForest here. Essentially, it would, as you're recording film, it would record sound by a light beam, which would essentially be modulated by sound waves. It's an interesting process. And then when you project it, it would project a beam of light through the soundtrack onto a photocell. Then you had the Vitaphone. Essentially, it was created by Western Electric, and it would use a phonograph to vibrate a stylus, which would create a groove on a wax surface, and that would be translated onto a record. Next slide. And then as we move on, we have the inception of color. The biggest success of this era was Technicolor. This was created by Herbert Kalmus in 1922. Some good examples would be The Toll of the Sea and The Black Pirate from the 1920s, both of which used the original method, which would be essentially creating two positives combined into one. Then we have The Wizard of Oz, which used a later method of using gelatinous positives. Then lastly, as we move into the modern day, there have been a lot of new tech that has really expanded film as just in general. A good example, something that's stuck around since the early days, would be 70mm film. It's been making a comeback with films like Dunkirk and The Hateful Eight. As you can see, there's a much wider aspect ratio and it makes colors more crisp. Then another good example would be CGI. It has really made leaps and bounds into what we can make as a realistic movie. As you can see in Jurassic Park here, It replaced stop motion animation, so it made it more complex, less laborious, and cleaner and crisper. And then another good example would be audio, especially Dolby Atmos. This is a very advanced surround sound that pretty much allowed the filmmaker to place sounds inside the theater. Any questions?
What do you think will be some of the next advances in presentation of movies?
There might even be some more advances in 3D, maybe in virtual reality from my research.
What about advances in sound technology?
At the current moment, I don't see anything moving past Atmos, considering it pretty much creates a three-dimensional sound. That we'll have to see.
Why do you think there's been some movement back to some older technologies by some directors and filmmakers?
Some more analog sound recording devices create more crisp sound, funnily enough, crisper than digital.
Any other reasons why they might go back toward older technologies with the film itself, not just the sound?
Maybe more kind of nostalgia in a way, as far as I'm aware.
For the ambiance, the
Yeah.
atmosphere.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks.